Welcome to Ham and Jam, the World War II British Airborne podcast, hosted by Andy Bryant and Kevin Getz.
Welcome to another episode of Ham and Jam. I'm Kevin Getz, reporting from Bloomington, Indiana, with my mate Andy. How you doing, Andy?
I'm doing very well, Kev. Very well indeed.
Well, I thought it was time for us to take a little journey. I think it's time for us to revisit Overlord, but I think it's time to get away from Pegasus Bridge. It's time for us to talk with a fabulous author. One Night in June is just absolutely a spectacular book. And I love the fact that it's telling the story of Operation Tonga. And thank you, Stephen Wright, for taking the time to be with us, basically telling the story that I think is often forgotten about. So thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks, Kev. It's good to be with you and Andy.
As is tradition, gentlemen, What are you drinking? Andy?
I'm making a change. You know, my favorite tipple normally is a Guinness. So I'm determined that I am going to do something different. So
Wait a minute. Leave it. Let me write this down. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think on one of the episodes I did have a root beer, but then again, I was in the States. But yeah, I'm actually drinking a Shipyard American IPA. And it's not bad, actually. I've never heard of it, and apparently neither of you. But so what about you, Kev?
I'm going with the old A&W cream and soda. A big fan of cream and soda. I thought I'd order one today.
Okay.
Stephen, what are you having?
Yeah, nothing at the moment, gents. I've got a nice little glass of port waiting for me up there.
Can't go wrong with a port.
Without further ado, gentlemen, we have to toast the episode in. So cheers.
Cheers. Stephen, where do you even begin with this? First of all, how did you come to the idea that I'm going to write One Night in June and then subsequently the follow-up book, Operation Tonga? What's the genesis of that?
Very simply, Kevin Shannon wrote a letter that was published in The Eagle, which was the magazine of the Glider Pilot Regimental Association. And he said to his dad, Bill Shannon, who was in D Squadron, been in Operation Tonga, amazing story as I learned later, but he said he'd just been thinking through the idea of maybe writing a book, and he just wanted to gather the experiences from any of the veterans who were in Tonga. So I read this letter and I thought, that's interesting, because my Uncle Billy was on Tonga, and I like a bit of history, I like a bit of writing, maybe we should have a conversation. So I wrote him a letter. I think then we probably spoke on the phone and we just decided that we would go for it. So then we wrote a letter in the Eagle saying that this is what we were going to do, and repeating the request for veterans of that operation to get in touch with us. And well, the rest is a book in 1994 and then the second edition 3 years later.
Do you have any experience in writing before this project you started, or is this completely new to you?
Not to that extent, no. I always enjoyed writing stories. I've been very blessed with having that gift of being able to get an idea and write a story around it. These gentlemen of the GPR, they gave us the words. So we let the guys tell the story, and then we were linking it together with the editorial. When I say we took these stories, we are pre-email. So we get these stories sent to us by letter. We get these stories sent to us on audio tape. So we are transcribing from letters, but we are also transcribing from tape as well. You remember the story of Jack Bowen, Johnny Bowen, who miraculously escaped death twice. Just amazing guy. He lived in Birmingham. He got in touch with us and I arranged to go and meet him. And I sat in his living room and we must have talked, I don't know, 2 hours. I was the first person that he'd ever told that story to. And that's not unusual, because at the end of the day, they joined the army and then they volunteered for the regiment. They got through all the rigors of selection, got into the GPR. Then they were trained to do a job. They went and did that job. The war ended. They went home back to their civilian lives and carried on. So Johnny Bowen, to sit and tell his story was just amazing. So we published a book and called it One Night in June.
And how did you actually get the foreword by General Hackett? How did that come about?
He was the patron of the association, and I just walked up to him and I told him what we've been doing and said it would be a great honor if he would write the foreword, and he very graciously did.
Yeah.
Stephen, looking back on it now, because you had said you're doing the interviews, you're getting the letters, and obviously one of the big hurdles that authors, researchers, historians who are doing books now, the issue obviously they're running into is this veteran is now in their late 90s or early 100s, or you're just talking to kids. And therefore, those memories, are they legit memories? Are they just recollections of conversations that they've had? Looking back at how fortunate do you think you were that you were actually able to capture? I mean, we're talking about like the 50th anniversary of Operation Overlord, and they're still at a relatively young enough age where these things are fresh to them.
Absolutely. We were unbelievably lucky to be able to get to those guys, to hit those gentlemen at the right stage, the right age. And a few of them had written their stories down. They kept diaries or they'd written manuscripts. It was fresh enough. But you're right, Kev, that the older we get, our memories do change, and we're not sure whether that was our memory or whether it was not invented, but an inherited memory almost. But I don't think we got any of that. But one of the things we found most interesting was that the number of them who would say to us, I didn't know about this. I had no idea that this was happening. And you begin very quickly to understand the significance of the phrase, the fog of war, because these guys had their job in their particular sector and their particular tasks. Yeah. With these guys to do this, they would have been briefed for the tasks of all the guys they were with in that particular sector, but they would only know in general terms what was happening elsewhere. And they certainly wouldn't know in specific terms once they were on the ground. So they were actually learning about what was happening elsewhere on that battleground and those few square miles of Normandy soil.
Just in case people aren't 100% aware of the Operation Tonga details, can you give us just a brief rundown of what was involved with Tonga? I mean, everybody knows about Operation Coup de Main. We won't say Dead Stick. We'll come on to that later on. That's another question. But give us a brief rundown of what was involved.
Let's start with the regiment, right? So the glider pilot regiment, we're talking about 98 gliders. So that means there are 98 aircraft that are needed to tow those gliders. So on top of that, then we've got 264 aircraft carrying parachute. So 6th Airborne Division, 3rd and 5th parachute brigades, each with 3 parachute battalions, and putting all those boots on the ground. Now, this is happening soon after midnight to soon after 3 a.m. So within a sort of 3-hour period, we're getting 2 parachute brigades on the ground with various tasks. Then we've got the gliders. So we've got the 2 coup de main operation. We've got the canal and the river bridge. We've got the oxen bucks, D company, B company, engineers. We've then got gliders that are flying in support of the other coup de main, which is the Merville Battery, which is the main of 9th Parachute Battalion, but also one of the tasks of the advance party of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion as well. One of their tasks was to be that reserve force, that backup force for 9th Parachute Battalion. Then we have got other gliders that are flying in guns and jeeps, they're flying in trailers, they're flying in medical supplies. We got them flying in bulldozers to help clear anti-glider poles out of the way in order to build 2 landing strips for the main glider force, which is going to be coming 2-3 hours later. And then we've got other advanced personnel, like the guys that were carried in my uncle's glider. So my uncle was Staff Sergeant Billy Marfleet. His second pilot was Sergeant Vic Haynes. They were in one flight, A Squadron, and left Harwell just after 11:15 on the night of the 5th of June. So they were amongst the first guys to actually leave the UK heading for Europe. Coming out of Harwell and Bryce Norton, we've got sticks of Pathfinders who are going out to mark the drop zones. In essence, I've got this armada of gliders and aircraft, parachute aircraft. Gliders, some with men, largely with equipment and guns. You've got these gliders and aircraft that are flying to Normandy to get these boots on the ground and to be a wall of steel, really, between the beaches and the panzers that they know are just sitting there waiting to go to the beaches as soon as somebody wakes up and realizes the Allies are actually invading in Calvados.
What is the level of quality of troop within 21st Panzer Division now in 1944 versus what it was in Tunisia and North Africa?
These are still top quality troops. Their commanding officer was Colonel Hans von Muck. This guy is a seasoned officer, and then he's got great quality officers. They are well seasoned troops. And we know that once the gates were opened and the Allies started to move, we know from the battles that ensued in the next few weeks just how professional and how fierce the fighters these Panzer guys were.
The thing that interests me about 21st as well is, you say about the quality of the troops, a lot of the vehicles were repurposed French tractors and half-tracks to make up their losses in North Africa.
They also had the Stug self-propelled gun, and it was important not just to get the soldiers on the ground, but equally important to get the artillery on the ground and to build this wall of artillery. And we know just how successful they were very early on in the morning of the 6th, while the guys on the beaches were still fighting their way off and starting to get inland. We've got the Vickers guns of 13th Parachute Battalion under Dixie Dean there. We've got them engaging Stugs and coming off victors over that.
This is the ring contour feature?
Yeah. It was an audacious plan that General Richard Windy Gale put together, but it was a plan forged in the knowledge and the trust he had in the men that he was sending in there.
We had talked about this previous episode with Ben Main about Richard Windy Gale, and how important of a role do you think he is in the success of what the Airborne, specifically what the glider pilot regiment's doing in Tonga?
It's huge, Kev. He visited every airfield in the UK before these guys took off, and he gave them this speech. And one of the lines, I guess it was the same speech, and I could just hear him delivering it. He said that the Germans think only a bloody fool would invade there. That's why I'm going. Can you imagine the guys there just cheering and just loving this commanding general? There's that famous photograph of him at Harwell standing on a trailer. This guy with his jodhpurs, and he just brought so much experience to that role. The other thing about 6th Airborne was that it was his division. He built it from the ground up.
Yeah.
So his finger would have been in everything. That division.
Does that play a really huge role in this as well?
He's setting up this division that has one task, and that is to go and defeat the enemy.
He was actually flown in by Billy Griffith, the England cricket captain.
Yeah, he was. And Billy Griffith was the commanding officer of A Squadron. So Richard Gale had made his headquarters at Harwell. We are so lucky to have footage from the time that shows him on the evening of the 5th, just walking among the guys and chatting with them and sharing a joke. This is their commanding general, and he's just having a stroll and having a chat with the fellows.
You called your reissue of One Night in June Operation Tonga, the glider assault. What are the lessons learned between Tonga and the last time that we've had a mass glider land in Sicily, obviously Ladbroke and Fustian? What are the difference between those two operations? What have they learned in the meantime?
The big lesson from Sicily was the fact that we had the friendly fire. And so big change for Normandy as a whole, not just for the British, but for the Americans as well, was the D-Day strikes, was the black and white strikes. And they were painted 24 hours before. Again, that Harwell footage. You got these two RAF Urks with a big paintbrush and a pot of whitewash,
In some of the photographs, you can still see the streaks where the paint has run on the side of the aircraft. It's that fresh.
Yeah, we just know now as D-Day strike. Every single aircraft that was flying to and over Normandy had those stripes painted on it.
At this stage, the relationship between the tug pilots and the glider pilots, that relationship did not exist in Sicily, and hence why you see quite a few of those Wacos end up in the Mediterranean. I know Chatterton was very big on making sure that those guys were all in the same airfield so that they can have this relationship.
Well, as I understand it, they've flown with the crews that were going to tow them to Normandy. So we've got that relationship. And then there's, again, from Harwell, we just got these amazing photographs and film. with the glider pilots and the RAF crew sitting in a room for a briefing, 3rd, 4th of June. So you can see them all being briefed together. Certainly Billy and Vic would have talked with Flight Lieutenant Christopher Lawson and his navigator. I'm sure they would have had those conversations.
Operation, was it Dream?
Exercise Dream.
Yes, Exercise Dream. So it's conducted in April. You have multiple crash gliders with multiple fatalities. Why was it deemed so necessary to have that? If they know their target area is June, why are we doing this level exercise so soon to the kickoff point, knowing that it's inherently risky?
So that it was the latest that they could go. This was what they were told with time and tide, waiting for no man and the weather. D-Day should have been the 5th of June, but that weather front just stopped all that happening. So there was this window that we were going for. But you read the squadron diaries and they are training from March. They're having these landings because they are getting ready to invade Europe. And I guess the commanders are saying, we've just got to get in as many hours as we can.
As we're talking about training, and we said we weren't going to talk too much about Pegasus Bridge, but the whole Operation Dead Stick myth, where does that come from and what's the reality?
Yeah. And why is everybody getting it wrong?
I don't think anybody honestly knows where it began. I'm sure it began sometime after the war, but I don't know who started it. It's a sort of bringing together of two things. There was an operation and there was Dead Stick, but the operation, as we find again from the squadron diaries, was coup de main, and Dead Stick was an exercise. Some people say that Dead Stick was the training for the coup de main pilots, those 6 gliders. But when you read John Howard's diary, he said that he soon came to realize that Dead Stick was the name for the whole of the airborne training. Then people say, if you've got Operation Tonga and you've got Operation Coup de Main, how can you have an operation within an operation? When we were able to get hold of the diaries, we're going through them as you would expect and just eking out every little bit we could find about the gliders. We came across this thing where it said for the Halifaxes that towed the coup de main gliders, that after the gliders had released, the Halifaxes then flew on and bombed a powder factory. Now, this is actually recorded in the diary. Our reasoning on that is that because they went on to do this bombing raid, it then became an RAF operation. So it became an operation on its own terms. Otherwise, it would have just been another task within Operation Tonga. So it got operational status because the Halifax bombers that towed the gliders then went on to do this bombing raid.
Do you think also that the longest day is playing a role in this as well? Pretty much all of the British airborne scenes are just restricted to Pegasus Bridge.
The only bit I think with the paratroopers is, when they're throwing out the Ruperts, which of course were completely wrong. And of course, the real Ruperts were Hessian frigates, just stuffed with sword or something.
I'm proud to say we actually have an original Rupert's at the Army Flying Museum.
Yeah, in reality, we're talking about 2 parachute brigades with 3 battalions. So 13th Parachute Battalion under Colonel Peter Luard. His 8th Company, under command of Major John Cramphorn, are tasked with Royal Engineers to clear the poles. And we've got 3 bulldozers coming in the horses. 1 goes down in the channel, 2 make it onto the ground, but only 1 is actually out of work, which is interesting because if you've read a book called By Air to Battle, it says in there it wasn't long before both bulldozers were at work clearing. But that's not true because there were 2 bulldozers in Normandy. That bit is true. But what is not true is that there were 2 working because 1 got stuck in the glider. Meanwhile, the other parts of 13th Battalion are pushing on into Roanville. They're clearing out the German garrison in Roanville. You've got 12th Parachute Battalion. They are heading down towards the ring contour. 13th Parachute Battalion, Vickers Machine Gun Platoon have been seconded to 12th Parachute Battalion. We've already talked about 9th Parachute Battalion. They're concerned with Merville. You've got 7th Parachute Battalion, which will grow to be the reinforcements for the Oxen Bucks at the bridges. 1st Canadians, they've got tasks to capture bridges. And in that respect, Tonga is very much like Market Garden, where it was a matter of bridges. And in Normandy, the same, it was a massive bridges. So you've got the canal bridge, you've got the river bridge, but then you've got the Dives River bridges. So the Canadians are over there. You've got the bridge down at Troarn, which was the job of the engineers to go and blow up. Major Tim Roseveare of the engineers. Now, when he got there, he found there was no Jeep and trailer. So again, wonderful story we got from the man himself. Staff Sergeant Laurie Whedon brings in a medical Jeep and trailer, and Tim Roseveare says, "Thank you very much, I'm having that." Takes all their kit out the trailer and the Jeep, piles his guys on it with all their explosives down there, off they go and blow a hole in the bridge down in Troarn.
And I've been saying the British Airborne story on D-Day is as much a story of the destruction of those bridges as it is the successful capture of the Pegasus Bridge. Famously, Trafford Lee Mallory is expressing concerns about the number of casualties, and he had forwarded a letter to Eisenhower. He's expressing this. He's got this extreme pessimistic view. Is that limited to just within those meetings, or are the airborne guys hearing this kind of chatter of there's going to be all these casualties?
They know what a risk they are taking with these men, because this whole thing is happening in the dark, and they know the ground that they are going to be landing in. LZN was huge, but it was riddled with obstacles. So we got walls, we got cows. And the one thing that surprised a lot of the men was the standing wheat. No one told them they were going to be landing in standing wheat. So that was a surprise when they came down in these yet to be harvested wheat fields.
I certainly distinctly remember an account that you and Kevin wrote about with regards to a horse slamming into a stone wall. And then the Jeep just completely broke free.
There's the one where Staff Sergeant Yorkie Steer and Sergeant Eric Wilson, they crashed into a house. And I found a photograph. It came up sometime. There's a glider that is buried in this house. I'm looking very carefully after zooming in or whatever, because I thought I'd see a choke on that. I couldn't believe it when it came up and it was their glider. So someone had taken a photo of Yorkie Steer and Eric Wilson's glider buried in this house. And that, again, is an amazing story, because they got the guys out and they thought that both pilots were dead. And in fact, Eric Wilson was very unconscious. And it was Padre Pear who managed to save him from being buried alive, because he put a mirror to his mouth and it steamed up. And so they got him to an aid station.
How does Stephen Wright react when somebody goes, well, all they did was just crash them every time?
Last year, when I was sharing an evening talking about Harwell and Operation Tonga, one of the gentlemen in the audience asked a question at the Normandy point, and he said that about crashing these guys. He said they crashed them, didn't they, and broke them open like an egg so the guys could get out. And I said, I'm sorry, that's just not true. We have so many people who talk about the gliders and crash landing. They crash landed.
If you can only see three people vigorously shaking their heads in the negative.
If they needed to, they could jettison the wheel. And then they got this really great skid underneath that they could land. So we know the wheels, to quote a phrase, we know the wheels came off because they did. Quite literally. And then they landed on the skid. And you've got the guys in John Howard's glide talking about seeing all these sparks flying up past the windows as they're skidding along towards the bridge. It was Roy Howard of the River Bridge, and they caught the cows. They were coming into land.
It took the nose wheel off, isn't it? That's right. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah.
There are books that you guys will have read called Flying Coffins. And they say that these guys, they called them flying coffins. I've never heard one glider pilot veteran refer to his glider as a flying coffin. I don't know whether that's an American thing.
It might be. And certainly because you've got 20 plus individuals in the back, there's going to be guys that say, oh yeah, that was a flying coffin. Or I know Woody talked about a guy from, I think it was the Ulsters. He equated it to sitting in a back garden shed and somebody pushes it off the cliff. Everybody's going to have a different perspective. Pretty much every account that, and I know Andy has read as well, is those glider pilots loved flying that horse. They absolutely loved. They said it was just a dream to fly.
We've spoken about this before in previous episodes, and so we're going to sort of repeat ourselves a little bit here. The unfortunate thing is the photographs at Pegasus Bridge, the photographs of crash gliders, gone through a wall, whatever, they make the headlines. They're the ones that people remember.
Yeah.
They don't remember the aerial shots of landing zone N, the landing zones at Arnhem, where the vast majority of those gliders have got down in one piece.
Absolutely. I would agree.
I mean, the gliders that landed in the evening of the 6th came down in daylight, so they got a better view. But I think all of the guys that landed their gliders on Tonga, the whole feat was extraordinary piece of flying. And this is something in the 2nd edition, the Pathfinders set their lights out in their T's as they had been briefed with the wind. Problem was that the wind changed. So by the time the gliders are coming in, instead of flying down the leg of the T into the wind, they're actually got the wind behind them. And so they're coming in much faster. So in the dark, with all the obstacles that you couldn't see, the wind and the weather conditions, just extraordinary flight.
What does it mean to be the nephew of a Tonga pilot?
Incredibly proud. I've been very lucky to have spent time in the company of men who knew my uncle. One in particular, Bob Shipwick, said he was just a brilliant pilot. He said on one occasion they were coming in after one of these mass lifts and they were coming back into Harwell. And he said, I was just trying to get on the ground before him and I couldn't. I'm almost whipping this like a horse to get on the ground and I couldn't do it. It was just a brilliant pilot. Now, if you know about the life of Billy Marfleet, where he came from and what he ended up doing, you think, well, how does he come from that to this? So many of the guys in the regiment would have come from very similar background and never dreamed of being a pilot. The family story is that Billy wanted to be a pilot and that when his papers came through, he went for the RAF and he went through all that battery of tests, the same tests that he would go through a few years later when he went to the regiment. And the reason he didn't become a pilot was he was too sure. And I just accepted sort of family story. But then looking at his record, which of course would have been filled in when he joined the army before he did any basic training, he was sort of same height as me, I guess, for that time, average height. So I don't know where that story, came. But you see, then it goes on from that because after he'd been away a few weeks, he'd been in the army and been fed like they were 3 a day and he'd done all the basic training and whatever. When they talk about this giant walking down the avenue, they called him Little Billy because he was a little fella. And then he came back and he was this giant.
And you got your chance to tell not only his story, but the story of a lot of GPR lads.
Yeah. And what's so humbling as well is to talk about these guys, to write about them. And what a great privilege to get these stories, to record them for posterity now. They're not here anymore. No. They're all gone.
No. Well, I know we could talk about this for hours. The GPR is a subject close to both mine and Kevin's hearts, but unfortunately, we are heading towards closing time. So all I can say is thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We've really enjoyed you being here. The new edition of the book Operation Tonga, the Glider Assault 6 June 44 is available now. So that really just leaves us to say thank you again.
Well, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for inviting me to be a guest on your podcast. You guys are doing great work. So thank you for that.
And thank you, Steve. So I'm just going to say, time, gentlemen, raise a glass if you got one. Cheers.
Cheers.
Ham and jam.
Ham and jam.
Thanks for listening to Ham and Jam. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help Andy and Kevin make more, please support us on buymeacoffee.com.
Gummy proper.